Alright, welcome back to Curl Gaming, where we discuss all things video games. Today we're going to take a look at an obscure Game Boy Advance title that has been ported over to the Switch, and that one I'm talking about is Ninja 5-0. Konami classic that's been lost to time. Apparently the Game Boy Advance cartridge is really expensive. I guess it didn't sell very well, and it's an awesome game. So with that being said, let's break into Ninja 5-0 running on the Switch, come back and discuss. Alright, welcome back to Curdle Gaming. Hopefully you like that look at Ninja 5.0 running on the Switch. Since this is the limited run release, you do also have the Japanese version called Ninja Cop on here as well. As far as I can tell, not too much has changed except for maybe difficulty spikes. Title screen as well. If I'm off, just let me know in the comments below. I did go back and try Ninja Cop. I did try one of the other levels that I didn't play through. Really like the game. I don't mind the Bionic Commando chain to swing around, but man, it sucks trying to get everything lined up to make those jumps, and you can see I did struggle. I'm sure there's an easier way. I'm sure if I check the manual, it'd be a lot better. I do wish Limited Run would have the manuals on the cart. Like, as far as I know, if you hit the trigger, it does bring up a menu, but I'm pretty sure it was just main menu, save, title screen, and something else. Maybe some options. But again, you go to the title screen and it gives you the option, okay, do you want to play Ninja 5.0 or do you want to play Ninja Cop? Just going through, all I could tell was minor differences with the title screen. Not sure about story elements, and then maybe some difficulty changes. But either way, they do give you both. You can try them out. And as I mentioned earlier, before we switch to gameplay footage, originally a Game Boy Advance title, and apparently it's fairly expensive. It was a small run, didn't sell very well. And if I'm not mistaken, there was a bunch of backlash when this was announced. A lot of people thought the value of their cartridge would tank, and I don't think that's the case. Granted, since this is a limited run release, I'm not sure how this has performed, because if you look, they've also ported Shantae, Extreme Sports, and can't remember what else. So you do have Game Boy Color games. This is a Game Boy Advance game, and I believe they have Shantae Advance coming out later on for the other systems. But to see something like this on the Switch, I'm perfectly okay with. I don't mind trying this out. I've never played it before, and I was aware of it when it was originally released, and for some reason just went under the radar. It's like, okay, that actually looks like a decent Konami game. 32 bits on the Game Boy Advance, nice side-scrolling venture, kind of Shinobi-ish like, with the addition of the extending arms. So kind of cross between Shinobi. You gotta rescue the hostages, then you have your chain, and then you can swing around and stuff. So towards the end of the video, you can see I do get a little bit more comfortable with the chain, but man, that still screws me up if I can't get it. So that frog boss, yeah, you need to use your chain to climb up to the platform. One thing I don't like, maybe I haven't done it properly, is to use your chain, get to the top of the platform, and then actually on top of the platform. I'm not sure if that's by design, where it seems like you have to get to the very edge and then you can access the top of the platform. But I feel you should be able to get up, chain the bottom, and flip up. Maybe I'm not doing something right, maybe I'm missing something. I may have to go online just to take a look at some of the documentation, manuals and stuff, but we'll see. I'll definitely come back and play this one again. The boss fights will have a pattern. As you can already see, that last frog boss that I got to does not look like it's a very long game, the 3 or 4 levels, and I'm not sure if there's going to be a big boss after that. So that was another thing I remember with the Game Boy Advance games. They were not very long at all. Some of the Nintendo titles were, just like Super Mario World, stuff like that they had ported over. Could be longer, but again, it was ports from older systems onto, at that time, new hardware. So that might be another sticking point with Ninja 5.0 and stuff like Shantae or Extreme Sports. You're porting portable games that were designed to be beaten within a short amount of time, but now you have them on a console. So if you had a compilation like the Cowabunga collection or the Castlevania collection where they throw the Game Boy titles on there, and you know they don't take very long, like maybe an hour tops to complete some of those, absolutely have a Game Boy collection or a Game Boy Advance collection with some of these smaller titles. Yeah, like even Castlevania Advance, all the Advance titles. But those games are actually fairly long. Konami did really good on those. So compilations like that, I don't mind. Having Ninja 5 by itself, again, I don't mind, but the original price point for the cartridge was, I don't think that one was very high, but at the same time, you are paying, I don't know, maybe it was like 40 US for this at the time, 35 or 40 US. May even been 29. Even still, I don't think the price point was that bad, especially compared to the original Game Boy Advance release now. And I believe the Advance release is still holding its value regardless of the Switch version being done. So anyway, let me know what your thoughts are. Have you played this before? Did you play it on a Switch? Did you play it on the Advance? One thing I like with the Switch version, again, you can blow it up to your main TV or take it on the go. It does beat the Game Boy Advance screen, so some of the graphics may be a little bit more pixelated, which you can see especially during the cutscenes, but that's just part of the charm in my view. But let me know what your thoughts are. Have you played this before? What version did you play? Have you played both? And if you did, if you do have the Advanced version, did you actually pick it up when it was cheap or when it was brand new, or was it a collector's piece that you ended up paying quite a bit for? Anyway, let me know what your thoughts are. If you haven't subscribed, feel free to subscribe. I do upload on a regular basis, and I'll catch you all next time. Thank you.